My husband once told me I belonged in the kitchen, that my paintings were worthless, and that I'd be nothing without him. He was wrong. Today, my art is worth more than his entire career, and the world knows exactly who he really is. Stay with me. What you're about to hear will make you understand the power of a woman who's had enough. My name is Linda Hansen, and for years, I lived in silence, a wife, a mother, and a woman whose dreams were locked away in a dusty attic. I was 42 when my world exploded, but let me tell you something. Sometimes the best chapters of your life begin when everything falls apart. This is the story of how I went from being invisible to becoming unstoppable. How I transformed from a woman who apologized for breathing too loudly into someone who made the world listen. It's about sacrifice, betrayal, rediscovery, revenge, and ultimately, triumph. And trust me, you'll want to hear how it ends, because the woman standing in that gallery today is nothing like the one who used to hide her paintings behind winter coats. If you've ever felt small, if you've ever been told your dreams don't matter, if you've ever wondered what would happen if you finally stopped playing it safe, this story is for you. When I was 25, I lived with paint under my fingernails and stars in my eyes. I was about to graduate from the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts, with gallery connections, a scholarship to New York, and a future that felt limitless. Then I met Richard. Richard Kellaway was everything I thought I wanted. Successful, confident, 6 years older, with a corner office at a prestigious accounting firm. He wore expensive suits and drove a BMW that smelled like leather and ambition. When he looked at me across that coffee shop near campus, I felt like I was finally being seen by someone who mattered. The courtship was intoxicating. Expensive dinners, weekend trips to wine country, flowers delivered to my tiny apartment. He would sit in my cramped studio space, watching me paint, telling me how talented I was, how different I was from other women he'd known. But somewhere between the engagement ring and the wedding planning, something shifted. You don't really need that graduate program, do you? I mean, we're starting a life together. I can provide for both of us. New York is so expensive, and you'd be away from me all the time. Wouldn't you rather focus on us? Those gallery connections, they're just trying to use you anyway. You're too pure for that world. Each suggestion felt reasonable in isolation. Each compromise seemed small. But looking back now, I can see how expertly he dismantled my future, piece by piece, while making me feel grateful for it. By our first anniversary, I was pregnant with our son Ethan, and my easel was collecting dust in what Richard called the spare room. By our second, that room had become his home office, and my art supplies were banished to the attic. My paintings, once displayed proudly on our walls, were replaced with Richard's corporate awards and landscape photographs that matched our beige sofa. The worst part wasn't the isolation from my dreams, it was how I convinced myself I was happy. How I practiced gratitude for a life that felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. Every day, I'd wake up in our suburban colonial, make Richard's coffee the way he liked it, pack Ethan's lunch with the crusts cut off just so, and pretend that the hollow ache in my chest was normal. Kitchen, not the office. Your head doesn't understand numbers, Linda. Leave the important stuff to me. Those weren't just Richard's words about his work, they became his philosophy about everything. My opinions on politics, our finances, even how to raise our own son were dismissed with that same condescending smile. I became a woman who existed in margins, speaking in whispers, apologizing for having needs. But here's what Richard never understood, and what I'm telling you now because maybe you need to hear it too. Every time someone tries to make you smaller, they're actually showing you exactly how much power you have. They're afraid of what happens when you remember who you are. Little did he know, every insult he threw at me was planting the seeds of his downfall. They say you know before you know, don't they? Your body picks up on betrayal before your mind is ready to accept it. For months, I felt this strange electricity in the air whenever Richard came home from work, like walking into a room where people had just stopped talking about you. Late nights at the office became the new normal. Weekend golf trips with clients multiplied. He started showering as soon as he walked through the door, claiming he felt gross after being in meetings all day. His phone, which used to lay casually on the kitchen counter, suddenly lived in his pocket, face down, on silent. I told myself I was being paranoid. Richard had always been dedicated to his career. It's what made him such a good provider, right? But then came the changes that were harder to ignore. Designer cologne I'd never smelled before. New shirts he claimed to have had for years. A credit card bill with restaurants I'd never been to and charges for flowers I'd never received. The discovery came, as these things often do, through sheer accident. It was a Tuesday morning in March. Richard had rushed out for work, forgetting his laptop on the kitchen table. Around 10, his office called asking if I could bring it to him. Apparently, he had an important presentation that afternoon. Of course I said yes. Of course I played the dutiful wife, driving 20 minutes in traffic to save the day for a man who'd forgotten I existed. His secretary, Jasmine, a 26-year-old blonde with legs that went on forever and a smile that could stop traffic, wasn't at her desk when I arrived. The receptionist told me she was in Mr. Kellaway's office, helping him prepare for his presentation. I knocked on his office door and walked in. They weren't preparing for any presentation. Jasmine was perched on the edge of Richard's desk, her blouse unbuttoned just enough to be scandalous, her hand running through his hair. Richard was leaning into her, whispering something that made her laugh, a sound like silver bells that I realized I'd been hearing in the background of his phone calls for months. The laptop slipped from my hands and clattered to the floor. Time stopped. Or maybe it sped up. I can't remember. What I do remember is the look on Richard's face, not guilt, not shame, but annoyance. Like I'd interrupted an important meeting. Like I was the problem. Linda, this isn't, we were just. But I was already backing toward the door, my cheeks burning with humiliation. The receptionist, the other staff members I'd passed in the hallway. Had they all known? Had I been the only fool in this story? I drove home in a daze, pulled into our driveway, and sat in the car for an hour, staring at our perfect suburban house with its perfect manicured lawn and perfect white picket fence. Everything we'd built together, every choice I'd made to support his dreams, every piece of myself I'd sacrificed for this life, it was all built on lies. That evening, Richard came home with flowers from the grocery store and an explanation so elaborate it was insulting. Jasmine had been upset about a personal matter. He was being a good boss, offering support. I'd misunderstood what I saw. But here's the thing about betrayal, once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. And suddenly, everything made sense. The late nights, the business trips, the way he'd been pulling away from me physically for months while somehow becoming more critical of everything I did. You know what your problem is, Linda? You're paranoid. You read too much into things. Maybe if you had something meaningful to occupy your time instead of sitting around the house all day, you wouldn't invent drama where none exists. Then came the words that would haunt him forever. Face it, you're nothing without me. You have no skills, no education that matters, no way to survive in the real world. This house, this life, Ethan's future, it all depends on me. So maybe focus on being grateful instead of looking for problems that don't exist. I nodded. I apologized. I put the grocery store flowers in water and made his favorite dinner. I played the part of the contrite wife who'd overreacted, who was lucky to have such a patient husband. But inside, something had cracked wide open. And what came pouring out wasn't grief or desperation. It was fury. If you think that broke me, wait until you hear what I did next. Have you ever been so angry that it felt like a superpower? That's where I was in the weeks following my discovery. I moved through our house like a ghost, going through the motions of normalcy while my mind raced with possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider. What if Richard was wrong about me? What if I wasn't helpless? What if the woman I used to be, the artist, the dreamer, the one with paint under her fingernails, was still in there somewhere, just waiting for permission to come back to life? 3 weeks after catching Richard with Jasmine, I climbed the narrow stairs to our attic for the first time in years. The space smelled like dust and forgotten dreams, filled with Christmas decorations, old furniture, and plastic bins labeled in my careful handwriting. But in the far corner, covered by a white sheet like a ghost, stood my old easel. My hands trembled as I pulled away the covering. There it was, exactly as I'd left it 7 years ago, still holding the last painting I'd ever finished. A stormy seascape that captured everything I'd felt but couldn't say about losing myself in marriage. Surrounding the easel, stacked against the walls like sleeping giants, were dozens of my old paintings. Canvases I'd forgotten existed. Work from my college years, pieces I'd started and never finished, studies and experiments and fragments of the artist I used to be. In the dusty light filtering through the small attic window, they looked like archaeological artifacts from a civilization that had vanished without a trace. But civilizations can be rebuilt, can't they? I spent hours that afternoon just looking, remembering. This landscape from a camping trip Richard and I took in our first year of marriage, back when he still pretended to care about my art. That portrait of Ethan as a toddler, painted during stolen moments while he napped. Abstract pieces born from emotions too complex for words, created in the brief window between his bedtime and Richard's return from work. The woman who had painted these wasn't helpless. She wasn't nothing. She had vision, talent, something to say. And maybe, just maybe, she still did. I found my old paint box in a corner, tubes dried out and brushes stiff with age, but salvageable. That weekend, while Richard was on one of his golf trips, I no longer believed they involved golf, I made my first art supply run in 7 years. Walking into that art store felt like coming home after a long exile. The smell of turpentine and fresh canvas, the rainbow wall of paint tubes, the brushes lined up like soldiers ready for battle, every sense memory came flooding back. The teenage clerk probably thought I was having some kind of episode. The way I stood there in the acrylic paint aisle with tears streaming down my face. I bought everything I needed to restart my life. Back in the attic, I set up my workspace like a secret laboratory. I could only paint when Richard was at work and Ethan was at school, but those stolen hours became sacred. The first few attempts were rough, my hand wasn't steady, my eye wasn't sharp, and I'd forgotten some basic techniques. But with each stroke of the brush, I felt more like myself than I had in years. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later. I was working on a piece inspired by my own reflection, a woman trapped behind glass, reaching toward something just out of frame. It was raw, emotional, filled with all the frustration and longing I'd been carrying. When I stepped back to look at it, I knew I'd painted something real. That's when I heard footsteps on the attic stairs. "Mom, are you up there?" Ethan, my 15-year-old son, appeared at the top of the stairs like an apparition. I'd been so lost in my work that I hadn't heard him come home from school. For a moment, we just stared at each other, me with a paintbrush in my hand like evidence of a crime, him taking in the transformed attic space. Then his eyes moved to the painting on the easel, and his expression changed completely. "Mom, did you paint this?" I nodded, suddenly terrified. What would he think of his mother's secret life? Would he tell his father? But Ethan moved closer to the canvas, studying it with the intensity of a museum curator. He walked around my makeshift studio, looking at the other pieces I'd been working on, the old paintings I'd unearthed. Finally, he turned back to me with something like awe in his eyes. "Mom, these are incredible. These belong out in the world, not hidden here with your pain." Out of the mouths of teenagers, right? In that moment, my son saw me more clearly than I'd seen myself in years. Not as Richard's wife or even as Ethan's mother, but as an artist. As a woman with something valuable to offer the world. "But your father," I started. "Dad doesn't get to decide who you are," Ethan said with the fierce certainty that only teenagers can muster. "And if he can't see how talented you are, that's his problem, not yours." That weekend, while Richard was at work, Ethan and I spent hours in the attic. He helped me photograph my paintings with his phone, teaching me about lighting and angles. Together, we researched online art markets, social media platforms for artists, and ways to sell artwork without a gallery. "You should start an Etsy shop," he suggested. "People love discovering new artists online. You could use a different name, keep it separate from everything else." The idea terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. Putting my work out there meant risking rejection, criticism, failure. But wasn't I already failing by keeping it hidden? We settled on the name LH Studios, my initials, but anonymous enough to protect my secret life. Ethan helped me set up the account, write descriptions for my pieces, and navigate the technical aspects of online selling that felt as foreign to me as rocket science. My first listing was The Woman Behind Glass, the painting Ethan had discovered me working on. I priced it at $200, which felt both too high and too low simultaneously. Ethan convinced me to list it as a limited edition print for $45, with the option to commission original work. I hit publish with shaking hands. The print sold within 6 hours. I still remember the notification ping from my phone, the way my heart hammered as I read the confirmation email. Someone, somewhere, had seen my work and wanted to pay for it. A stranger had looked at something I'd created from my pain and found it worth owning. The buyer left a review that made me cry. This piece speaks to me on such a deep level. There's so much emotion in the brushwork. Thank you for sharing your gift with the world. I thought it was a fluke. A lucky break. A one-time thing. The orders didn't stop. They multiplied. What happens when a woman who's been told she's worthless discovers she's actually priceless? What happens when someone who spent years making herself smaller suddenly remembers how much space she's allowed to take up? For me, it started with that first sale, but it exploded into something I never could have imagined. Within a month, LH Studios had sold 37 pieces, prints, small originals, and commissioned work. My attic studio, once a dusty storage space, had transformed into a production facility. I'd invested my profits back into better supplies, proper lighting, and a system for photographing and shipping my work. The money wasn't life-changing yet, but it was mine. For the first time in 15 years of marriage, I had income that didn't depend on Richard's approval or generosity. Every deposit into my secret bank account felt like a small act of revolution. But here's what really changed everything: the feedback from customers. Your work helped me through my divorce. I hung your painting in my office to remind me of my own strength. This piece captures exactly what I've been feeling but couldn't put into words. These weren't just sales, they were connections. My art was speaking to people, helping them, meaning something in their lives. The woman Richard claimed was worthless was actually creating value for strangers across the country. My confidence grew with each order. I started experimenting with larger pieces, bolder colors, more complex compositions. The technical skills came back faster than I'd expected, but more importantly, I was finding my voice as an artist. These weren't the safe, pretty paintings of my college days. These were raw, honest works born from real experience, real pain, real hope. And through it all, Richard remained completely oblivious. Every morning, he'd kiss me goodbye and head off to his affair, never questioning why I seemed happier lately, why I had a new energy in my step. He was so absorbed in his double life that he couldn't see I'd started living one too. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he was telling Jasmine that his wife was a boring housewife who didn't understand him, that same wife was building an art business that was bringing in more money each month than his secretary made at her day job. 3 months after my first sale, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to start selling my original paintings, not just prints. The large canvases from my college days, the pieces I'd been working on in secret, it was time to see what they were really worth. I started with a landscape I'd painted of the view from our bedroom window, but filtered through my emotional state. Storm clouds gathering over suburban perfection, lightning illuminating the cracks in seemingly solid foundations. I'd priced my prints at $45, small originals at $200. For this piece, following Ethan's advice and my own growing confidence, I set the price at $1,200. It sold in 3 days. That's when I realized I'd been thinking too small. I went back to my inventory with new eyes. The stormy seascape from the easel, the woman behind glass, the abstract pieces born from years of suppressed emotion. What if these weren't just therapeutic exercises? What if they were valuable artworks that I'd been giving away for practically nothing? I spent a weekend researching comparable artists, studying pricing strategies, learning about the actual art market instead of just hoping someone would buy my work. What I discovered shocked me. My paintings, particularly the older ones with their sophisticated technique and emotional depth, were significantly underpriced for their quality. The next Monday morning, after Richard left for work and his affair, I climbed those attic stairs with a new sense of purpose. I catalogued every painting I owned, 43 pieces total, ranging from small studies to large statement works. Some needed minor touch-ups, others were perfect as they were, but all of them deserved to be seen. I spent the next week preparing for what I now think of as my relaunch. Better photography, professional descriptions, and most importantly, prices that reflected the true value of my work. The smallest pieces started at $500. The large, significant paintings, the ones that took my breath away even years later, were priced at $25,000 each. Richard, if he'd known, would have laughed at my audacity. Who did I think I was, charging professional prices for paintings by a nobody housewife? But here's what I'd learned in those months of secret selling. I wasn't a nobody. My work had already proven its worth to hundreds of customers who had no idea who Linda Hansen was, who bought my art purely because it moved them. On a Tuesday morning in late September, I relaunched LH Studios with my full catalogue. The first painting sold within 4 hours. By the end of the week, I'd sold 12 pieces for a total of $147,000. Within 2 weeks, 60 paintings had sold, and my secret bank account had nearly $2 million in it. The art world had discovered LH Studios, and LH Studios was about to discover just how far she could rise. Richard still mocked my little hobby whenever he bothered to acknowledge it at all. He still laughed at the idea that my work could be worth anything, still called my paintings trash when he caught glimpses of my supplies in the laundry room. Oh, how I waited for the perfect moment to show him just how wrong he was. And while the world celebrated me, while art bloggers wrote about the mysterious LH Studios and collectors scrambled to acquire pieces before prices went even higher, Richard had no idea. He still laughed at me, still called my work trash, still came home from his affair and told me I was lucky to have a man who put up with my foolishness. If he'd bothered to look, really look, at the woman he claimed to know so well, he might have noticed the way I carried myself differently now. The way I smiled when I thought no one was watching. The confidence that was growing stronger every day, fed by the knowledge that I wasn't just surviving without him, I was thriving. But Richard had never been good at seeing what was right in front of him. This wasn't just art anymore, this was war. And I was painting my battlefield. Success is intoxicating, but revenge requires patience, planning, and perfect timing. By October, LH Studios wasn't just selling paintings, it was becoming a phenomenon. Art collectors were comparing my work to established masters. Gallery owners were reaching out through my website, begging for the chance to represent the mysterious LH. But I wasn't ready to reveal myself yet. I had bigger plans brewing, ones that required careful orchestration and flawless execution. The first piece of my strategy was legal protection. I'd been researching divorce law in our state, consulting with attorneys online under fake names, understanding exactly what I'd be entitled to and how to protect my newfound assets. What I learned was both encouraging and infuriating. Pennsylvania was an equitable distribution state, meaning Richard would have claim to half of everything we'd built together during our marriage. Everything except what I could prove was mine alone. My art sales, conducted under a business license I'd quietly obtained using my maiden name, were legally separate from our marital assets. The nearly $3 million now sitting in my personal accounts, money Richard didn't even know existed, was mine to keep. But I wanted more than financial independence. I wanted justice. The second piece was evidence. Those months of suspicion had taught me to be observant, and now I turned that skill toward documentation. I hired a private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Detective Sarah Morrison who specialized in infidelity cases. Within 2 weeks, she'd provided me with enough photographic evidence and documentation to bury Richard in any divorce proceeding. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, even photos of Richard and Jasmine at a romantic weekend getaway he'd claimed was a business conference. The investigator's report read like a bad novel. 2 years of systematic deception, company resources used for personal affairs, and professional misconduct that could cost Richard his job if it became public. But the third piece of my plan was the most delicious. The art world was calling, and I was ready to answer. Gallery invitations had been pouring in through my website for months. The Philadelphia Museum of Fine Arts wanted to feature LH Studios in their Emerging Artist Showcase. A gallery in New York was offering a solo exhibition. Art collectors from as far as Los Angeles were commissioning custom pieces. But the offer that made my heart race came from Morrison Gallery, the most prestigious contemporary art space in Philadelphia. The same gallery I dreamed of showing in during my college days, back when I thought I had a future as an artist. Victoria Morrison, the gallery's owner, had been tracking LH Studios' meteoric rise with the intensity of a hunter following prey. Her email was effusive in its praise and urgent in its invitation. "The art world is buzzing about your work. We've had collectors asking specifically for LH Studios pieces. I'd like to offer you a solo exhibition, 60 pieces, full catalogue, opening night reception with our VIP collector list. This could be the launch of a major career. Please contact me immediately to discuss details." A solo exhibition. 60 pieces. VIP collectors. Everything I'd dreamed of 17 years ago was being offered to me now, at the moment when I needed it most. But Victoria Morrison didn't know who LH Studios really was yet, and that gave me leverage I intended to use. I scheduled a meeting with Victoria for late November, giving myself 6 weeks to prepare what I now thought of as my debut and Richard's downfall simultaneously. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would reveal my identity at the gallery opening, surrounded by art world luminaries, collectors, and most importantly, local media. The same media that would be very interested in the detective's report about Richard's affair and professional misconduct. During those 6 weeks of preparation, I moved through our house like a woman possessed. I selected 60 of my strongest pieces, including several I painted specifically for the exhibition, works that dealt directly with themes of betrayal, rebirth, and revenge. The centerpiece would be a massive triptych I'd titled The Unraveling. 3 panels showing a woman breaking free from shadows, discovering her power, and emerging transformed. Richard noticed my energy, but in typical fashion, he misinterpreted it completely. "You've seemed happier lately. I'm glad you're finally getting over your paranoia about Jasmine. I told you there was nothing to worry about." If only he knew that my happiness had nothing to do with getting over anything and everything to do with getting ready for everything. I also spent those weeks preparing for the practical realities of my new life. I found a lawyer, a shark of a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for leaving opposing counsel blooded in the water. I scouted apartments, researched schools for Ethan, and opened additional bank accounts to manage my growing wealth. My son, now fully my co-conspirator, helped me plan the exhibition's most dramatic moment. We designed the gallery layout so that visitors would experience my artistic journey chronologically, from the constrained early works of my marriage through the explosive rebirth of my recent pieces. The final room would contain The Unraveling and one additional painting I was saving for last, a portrait I'd never shown anyone. A portrait of Richard, painted from memory and years of suppressed rage. I'd titled it "Numbers Don't Understand the Heart," and it captured every dismissive look, every condescending smile, every moment he'd made me feel small. It wasn't flattery, it was indictment rendered in oil and canvas. "Are you really going to sell a painting of Dad?" Ethan had asked when he first saw it. "I'm going to do better than that. I'm going to make sure it sells for more than his yearly salary." 3 weeks before the exhibition, Victoria Morrison and I finally met in person. She was a striking woman in her 50s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that made art collectors reach for their checkbooks. Her gallery occupied a converted warehouse in Philadelphia's Arts District, all soaring ceilings and perfect lighting. She'd been expecting someone younger, I could tell. The mysterious LH Studios had been imagined as a tortured 20-something, not a suburban housewife approaching middle age. But when Victoria saw my work in person, really saw it, studied it with the expertise of someone who'd been in the art world for 30 years, her surprise melted into something like awe. "These aren't just paintings. They're psychological landscapes. There's a narrative here, a journey from constraint to freedom that's going to resonate with everyone who sees it." We spent 3 hours planning the exhibition details. The opening would be December 15th, a Friday evening that would attract the perfect mix of serious collectors and social influencers. The guest list would include art critics from major publications, museum curators, and what Victoria called Philadelphia's cultural elite. "I assume you'll want to maintain some privacy about your identity until the opening." "Actually, I want to do more than that. I want the identity reveal to be the climax of the evening. Build mystery in your marketing. Talk about the reclusive artist, the sudden emergence of this major talent. Then, during my speech, I'll introduce myself properly. Victoria's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of someone who recognized a publicity goldmine. That's brilliant. The art world loves a mystery, and the reveal will generate massive media coverage. This could be the event of the season. We shook hands on a deal that would have seemed impossible to the woman I'd been a year ago. 60 paintings, with prices ranging from $15,000 to $75,000, and a 50-50 split with the gallery after expenses. Even if only half the pieces sold, I'd walk away with over $1 million from a single evening. But money was no longer the point. The exhibition was my debut, my declaration. My revenge served at exactly the right temperature. On my way home from that meeting, I made one final stop, the office of Patricia Hendricks, divorce attorney extraordinaire. I delivered copies of the detective's report, financial records showing my separate assets, and a request for her to prepare divorce papers to be served the morning after my exhibition opening. You want me to time the service for maximum impact. I want my husband to receive divorce papers while the morning news is running stories about his wife's successful art career and his own professional misconduct. I want him to understand that while he was playing games, I was building an empire. Patricia smiled with the appreciation of someone who recognized an artist at work, not just on canvas, but on life itself. Mrs. Hansen, this is going to be the most satisfying case I've handled all year. Everything was in place. The gallery was booked, the paintings were selected, the media was primed, and the legal machinery was loaded and ready to fire. Now all that remained was the performance of a lifetime. December 15th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of winter morning that makes everything look sharp-edged and full of possibility. I woke up in my suburban bedroom, next to my cheating husband, and felt like I was about to step into a completely different life. Richard was in an unusually good mood at breakfast, probably because he had plans to spend the evening with Jasmine while I attended what he assumed was some small community art show. Have fun at your little exhibition tonight. Try not to be out too late, I might actually be home at a reasonable hour for once. If only he knew that his reasonable hour would coincide with the moment his entire world imploded. The day passed in a blur of final preparations. Victoria and I had spent the week installing the exhibition, and seeing 60 of my paintings displayed in perfect gallery lighting was surreal. These pieces, born from pain, crafted in secret, sold in shadows, now commanded the pristine white walls like they'd always belonged there. The gallery had transformed my artistic journey into a pilgrimage. Visitors would enter with my earliest works, paintings that showed technical skill but emotional restraint. As they moved through the space, they'd witness my evolution, the gradual loosening of technique, the increasing boldness of color, the growing confidence of composition. And in the final room, they'd encounter my masterpieces, the unraveling triptych and the portrait of Richard that no one had seen yet. Victoria had outdone herself with the marketing. For weeks, Philadelphia's art scene had been buzzing about the mysterious LH Studios exhibition. The guest list read like a who's who of cultural influence. Museum directors, major collectors, art critics from national publications, and local media personalities looking for the next big story. By 6 o'clock, the gallery was packed. I'd chosen my outfit carefully. A black dress that was elegant but not flashy, minimal jewelry, my hair pulled back in a way that suggested seriousness without severity. I wanted to look like an artist, not a society wife playing at creativity. For the first hour, I moved through the crowd anonymously. LH Studios was supposed to be there, but Victoria had told everyone the artist was notoriously shy and might not reveal themselves until later in the evening. This gave me the perfect opportunity to eavesdrop on reactions to my work. The technique is sophisticated, but there's something raw about the emotional content. You can see a clear evolution in the artist's confidence. These aren't decorative pieces, they're statements. I heard the portrait in the back room is controversial. Whatever LH Studios is charging, it's not enough. By 7:30, the crowd was getting restless for the artist reveal. Victoria caught my eye from across the room and nodded. It was time. She called for attention, and the gallery gradually quieted. Art openings are social events first and foremost, but there's always a moment when the serious business begins, when people remember they're there for the art, not just the wine and networking. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight for what I believe will be remembered as a landmark exhibition. Over the past year, LH Studios has emerged as one of the most compelling voices in contemporary art. The work you see here tonight represents not just technical mastery, but profound emotional truth. Victoria paused, letting the anticipation build. The artist has asked to remain anonymous until tonight, but I'm thrilled to finally introduce you to the woman behind these extraordinary paintings. My heart was hammering, but I felt calm. This was my moment, not just as an artist, but as a woman reclaiming her power. It gives me great pleasure to present Linda Hansen, LH Studios. I stepped forward, and you could feel the energy in the room shift. They'd been expecting someone younger. Probably. Someone who looked more like their preconceptions of a tortured artist. Instead, they got a 42-year-old suburban mother who'd just revealed herself to be one of the most talked-about artists in the city. Thank you all for being here tonight. A year ago, I was a woman who had forgotten she existed. I was told my dreams didn't matter, that my art was worthless, that I should be grateful for a life that felt like a beautiful prison. Tonight, surrounded by people who understand the power of creative expression, I want to tell you why these paintings exist. I paused, looking out at faces that were completely focused on my words. In the back of the room, I spotted several local news reporters with cameras, drawn by Victoria's masterful publicity campaign. Art has always been my language for things that can't be spoken. These paintings chronicle a journey from silence to voice, from invisibility to presence. They represent what happens when a woman stops apologizing for taking up space and starts claiming the room she deserves. The crowd was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word. But tonight isn't just about artistic revelation. It's about truth in all its forms. I nodded to Victoria, who gestured toward the final room where Richard's portrait waited, hidden behind a curtain we'd installed for maximum dramatic impact. In that room, you'll find my most recent work, a portrait of someone who believed he could define my worth, who thought my value was determined by his approval. It's titled Numbers Don't Understand the Heart, and it represents everything I've had to overcome to stand here tonight. The crowd began moving toward the back room like a wave. I followed, my pulse racing, knowing that in moments, Richard's face would be revealed to Philadelphia's art world along with the story of what he'd done. Victoria pulled the curtain. The painting was devastating in its honesty. I'd captured Richard not as he saw himself, successful, commanding, attractive, but as he truly was. The portrait showed every line of arrogance in his face, every trace of cruelty in his smile, every ounce of contempt in his eyes. It was technically masterful but emotionally brutal, a psychological dissection rendered in oils. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Whispers rippled through the room as people recognized the portrait's unflinching psychological insight. The subject of this painting spent years convincing me I was nothing without him. He mocked my art, dismissed my dreams, and treated me like a decoration in his perfectly ordered life. While he said these things, he was conducting an affair with his secretary, using company resources for personal pleasure, and lying to everyone who trusted him. The whispers grew louder. Several reporters were scribbling frantically, and I could see cameras capturing every word. But this portrait isn't about revenge, it's about truth. It's about what happens when someone underestimates the woman they think they've broken. It's about the power of art to transform pain into purpose. Victoria stepped forward, sensing the perfect moment for the business side of art. The portrait is priced at $75,000. Before she'd finished speaking, 3 hands shot up from different parts of the crowd. Sold to the Museum of Contemporary Art, Victoria announced, recognizing the curator who'd been tracking my work for months. The room erupted in applause, but I wasn't finished. There's something else you should know. The man in this portrait, my husband, Richard Kellaway of Kellaway and Associates, is here tonight. Not physically, but his presence looms over everything you've seen. While I was building this career in secret, he was building lies. While I was discovering my worth, he was forgetting his. I could see reporters making phone calls, probably to editors who were realizing this story was bigger than just an art opening. Tomorrow morning, Mr. Kellaway will receive divorce papers along with evidence of his infidelity and professional misconduct. Tonight, he thinks his wife is at a small community art show. Tomorrow, he'll wake up to discover that his wife has become someone he never bothered to know. The applause was thunderous now, but what moved me most were the faces in the crowd, especially the women, who understood exactly what they were witnessing. This wasn't just an art exhibition. It was a declaration of independence, a masterclass in turning pain into power. Over the next hour, 37 of my 60 paintings sold. The final tally was staggering. $1.8 million in a single evening, with waiting lists for future work and gallery owners from New York and Los Angeles requesting meetings. But the real victory was walking out of that gallery as someone completely different from the woman who'd walked in. I wasn't just Linda Hansen anymore. I was LH Studios, a force to be reckoned with, a woman who'd transformed betrayal into triumph. And just as applause filled the room one final time, my phone buzzed with a text from Detective Morrison. Story broke online 20 minutes ago. Photos, emails, everything. It's everywhere. I looked around the gallery one last time, at the red dots next to sold paintings, at the crowd still buzzing with excitement, at the life I'd built from the ashes of the one I'd lost. The news had broken. Richard's world was about to implode. And I didn't even have to name him. The world already knew. Have you ever watched a controlled demolition? The way a building that seemed solid and permanent just collapses in on itself once the right supports are removed. That's what happened to Richard's life in the 72 hours following my exhibition. I didn't go home that night. Instead, Ethan and I, he'd been there for my triumph, of course, checked into the Four Seasons, where we ordered room service and watched the story unfold in real time on social media and local news. By midnight, Philadelphia housewife's secret art empire was trending on Twitter. The Philadelphia Inquirer had posted an online exclusive about my exhibition, complete with photos of the sold-out gallery and quotes from prominent collectors. But more damaging for Richard, investigative journalists had picked up the thread about his affair and professional misconduct. The Delaware Valley Business Journal posted a bombshell piece at 2 a.m., accounting executive under investigation for misuse of company resources. They'd gotten hold of Detective Morrison's evidence, the hotel receipts, restaurant bills, and company credit card statements that showed systematic abuse of his position. Richard's company, Kellaway and Associates, released a statement before the markets opened Monday morning. We take allegations of professional misconduct seriously and have placed Richard Kellaway on administrative leave pending a full investigation. But the professional humiliation was just the beginning. By Monday afternoon, Jasmine had resigned from her position and released a statement through her attorney distancing herself from the affair and claiming she'd been manipulated by a supervisor who abused his position of power. Whether that was true or strategic, it left Richard completely isolated, with no allies in his professional or personal life. The divorce papers were served at exactly 9 a.m. Monday morning, just as I'd planned. Patricia Hendricks had timed it perfectly. Richard was in the middle of a crisis meeting with his company's legal team when the process server arrived at his office. According to Patricia's sources, he'd actually gone white when he read the filing and realized his wife wasn't the helpless woman he'd imagined. But here's what really destroyed him: the art world's reaction to my portrait. Numbers don't understand the heart became an instant sensation. Art critics were calling it a devastating psychological study and a masterpiece of personal truth. The Museum of Contemporary Art announced they'd be featuring it in their upcoming exhibition on art as social commentary. Richard's face was everywhere, not as a successful businessman, but as the subject of a painting that exposed every ugly truth about his character. People who knew him professionally were seeing him through my eyes now, understanding exactly what kind of man he really was. His friends started avoiding him. The country club where he'd been a member for 12 years quietly suggested he might want to take a temporary leave of absence. Neighbors who'd once envied our perfect suburban life now looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. The financial impact was swift and brutal. Kellaway and Associates terminated him by Wednesday, citing serious breaches of professional conduct that compromised the firm's reputation and client relationships. Without his six-figure salary and with legal fees mounting, Richard suddenly found himself cash poor for the first time in his adult life. Meanwhile, my career was exploding in the best possible way. Gallery owners from New York, Los Angeles, and even London were calling with exhibition offers. Art collectors who'd missed out on pieces from my Philadelphia show were commissioning new work at prices that kept escalating. A documentary filmmaker wanted to chronicle my journey from housewife to art sensation. But the sweetest victory came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the exhibition, I was in my new apartment, a gorgeous loft in Philadelphia's Arts District, purchased with cash from my art sales, when Ethan brought me a package that had been delivered to our old house. It was from the Philadelphia Academy of Fine Arts, my old art school. Inside was a letter from the current dean. Dear Ms. Hansen, the faculty and I have been following your remarkable emergence in the contemporary art world with great pride and interest. Your recent exhibition represents exactly the kind of fearless, authentic artistic voice we strive to cultivate in our students. We would be honored to offer you a position as visiting artist in residence for the spring semester, and we hope you'll consider sharing your journey with the next generation of artists. The woman who'd been told her art was worthless was being invited to teach at one of the country's most prestigious art schools. I called the dean that afternoon and accepted. But Richard's downfall wasn't finished yet. The investigation into his professional conduct had uncovered additional financial irregularities, expense reports for personal purchases, inflated travel costs, and what appeared to be kickback arrangements with several vendors. The district attorney's office announced they were considering fraud charges. By February, Richard had moved into a studio apartment in a complex that catered to divorced men starting over. He'd sold his BMW to pay legal fees and was driving a 10-year-old Honda that made him look exactly like what he'd become, a middle-aged man whose arrogance had destroyed everything he'd built. I ran into him once, at a grocery store near our old neighborhood. He looked haggard, defeated, like he'd aged 10 years in 6 months. When he saw me, his face went through a series of emotions: shame, anger, disbelief, and finally something that might have been respect. Linda. Richard. We stood there for a moment, two people who'd shared 15 years of marriage and now lived in completely different worlds. I never knew you had it in you, he said finally. That was your first mistake. The second was thinking it didn't matter. He nodded slowly, understanding finally reaching his eyes. For what it's worth, the paintings they're extraordinary. You were always talented. I just couldn't see it. No, Richard. You could see it. That's why you worked so hard to make me forget it. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Maybe he was finally ready to face some uncomfortable truths about himself. I heard about the teaching position. And the gallery in New York wants a show. 3 galleries in New York, actually. Plus 1 in London. He almost smiled then, but it was tinged with sadness and regret. You know what's funny? I always told people my wife was an artist. Back in the beginning. I was proud of that. I don't know when I stopped being proud and started being threatened. The moment you realized I might be good enough to not need you. We parted ways there in the cereal aisle, 2 people who'd loved each other once upon a time, before fear and selfishness had poisoned everything good between us. But that encounter confirmed something I'd suspected for months. Richard's fall wasn't just about professional disgrace or financial ruin. It was about the slow, crushing realization that he'd destroyed his marriage to a woman who was far more remarkable than he'd ever allowed himself to acknowledge. He once told me I'd be nothing without him. Now, he was nothing without me. If you think the story ends with Richard's disgrace and my artistic triumph, you don't understand how deeply satisfying a perfectly executed revenge can be. Because the sweetest victory wasn't the gallery opening or the museum acquisition, or even seeing my former husband reduced to driving a decade-old Honda. The sweetest victory was yet to come. By March, my art career had reached heights I'd never dared imagine. The New York exhibition was scheduled for May at the prestigious Whitmore Gallery in Chelsea. The London show would follow in September. Art collectors were getting into bidding wars over my pieces, and I was booked solid with commissions through the following year. But I had one more painting to complete. One final piece that would close the chapter on my old life and announce the beginning of my new one. I'd been working on it in secret, even from Ethan, in the private studio space of my loft apartment. It was a self-portrait, but not in any traditional sense. Instead of painting my physical appearance, I was creating a visual autobiography, layers upon layers of imagery that told the story of my transformation. In the deepest layer, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was the shadow of a woman in an apron, small and hunched, surrounded by kitchen appliances and cleaning supplies. Over that, in increasingly bold strokes, were images of paintbrushes breaking through walls, canvases exploding with color, a woman's silhouette growing larger and more confident with each layer. At the very top, dominating the composition, was a figure I'd painted in pure gold leaf, a woman with paint-stained hands raised toward a sky full of possibility, surrounded by floating dollar signs, gallery lights, and applauding crowds. But the most important detail was what lay at her feet, a broken chain, painted in the darkest black I could mix. I titled it Liberation, a self-portrait, and I knew exactly where it needed to be shown first. The Philadelphia Museum of Fine Arts had been courting me since my exhibition, asking for a major piece for their permanent collection. This would be it, not just another painting by LH Studios, but the definitive statement of my artistic identity. The unveiling was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in late April. Unlike my gallery opening, this was a formal museum event, with art critics, major donors, and what the curator called serious collectors in attendance. The painting would be donated to the museum's permanent collection, ensuring that my story would be preserved for future generations. But I had one more surprise planned, one that would put the perfect exclamation point on everything I'd accomplished. On the morning of the unveiling, I placed a call to Richard. "Hello, Linda." His voice sounded tired, defeated. "Richard, I wanted to let you know about something that's happening today." I told him about the museum unveiling, about the permanent collection, about the painting that chronicled my journey from his kitchen to my gallery. "I thought you should know that your portrait, Numbers Don't Understand the Heart, has been acquired by the Museum of Contemporary Art. It's going to be part of their permanent collection too." Silence on the other end of the line. "Linda, why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand something. You tried to make me disappear, to convince me I was nothing. Instead, you've become part of my permanent legacy. Museums will display my work for decades, maybe centuries. And your face will be there too, not as a successful man or a loving husband, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when someone underestimates the woman they think they've broken." Another long pause. "You've won, Linda. Isn't that enough?" "This isn't about winning, Richard. It's about truth. And the truth is, you gave me the greatest gift you could have given. You showed me exactly who I didn't want to be." "What do you mean?" "I spent 15 years trying to be small enough for your comfort, quiet enough for your peace, invisible enough for your ego. When you forced me to choose between staying small and fighting for my life, you made the choice easy." That afternoon, standing in front of 300 people at the Philadelphia Museum of Fine Arts, I unveiled Liberation, a self-portrait to thunderous applause. The painting would hang in the museum's contemporary wing, directly across from a Picasso and 2 galleries down from a Monet. But the moment that took my breath away came during the reception afterward, when a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Hansen, I'm Sarah. I'm 24, and I've been married for 2 years to a man who tells me my writing is just a hobby, that I should focus on supporting his career instead. Seeing your work, hearing your story, I think I need to make some changes." I looked around the room and saw them everywhere. Women of all ages who saw themselves in my journey, who understood that my story wasn't just about art or revenge, but about reclaiming a life that someone else had tried to define. "Sarah, can I tell you something? The most dangerous thing a woman can do is remember who she was before the world told her who to be." 6 months later, Sarah published her first novel. She sent me a signed copy with a note, "Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to paint your own portrait." The final piece of my revenge wasn't about destroying Richard. It was about inspiring other women to refuse to be destroyed. But there was one last twist I hadn't expected. A year after my museum unveiling, I received a letter at my gallery. The return address was Richard's studio apartment, but the handwriting was different. Neater, more careful than his usual scrawl. "Dear Linda, this is difficult to write, but I think you need to hear it. I've been in therapy since the divorce, trying to understand how I became the man in your painting. You were right about everything. I was threatened by your talent, terrified that if you remembered how extraordinary you were, you wouldn't need me anymore. So I spent 15 years trying to make you forget, and in the process, I forgot who I fell in love with. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I don't deserve it. I'm just asking you to know that seeing your success, your happiness, your incredible art, it's made me want to become someone worthy of the woman who was brave enough to paint the truth. I'm proud of you. I always should have been. Richard. I read the letter twice, then filed it away in a folder I keep for correspondence that matters. Not because I was considering reconciliation, that ship had sailed, burned, and sunk in the deepest ocean, but because it represented something important, the moment when someone who tried to diminish me finally understood the magnitude of what he'd lost. 3 years later, I'm standing in my gallery, not just showing in one, but owning one. LH Studios Gallery occupies a converted warehouse in Philadelphia's Arts District, and it's become the city's premier destination for contemporary art by women who refuse to be ignored. The opening night of my retrospective exhibition, From Kitchen to Canvas, A Journey in Paint, is in full swing. 300 people fill the space, including Sarah, who's now published 3 novels, and dozens of other women who've told me my story helped them reclaim their own lives. But the piece that draws the most attention isn't one of my paintings. It's displayed in a place of honor near the gallery entrance. An apron, the same one I used to wear while making Richard's breakfast every morning, now mounted in a custom frame. The placard beside it reads, "The kitchen was never my cage," mixed media installation by Linda Hansen, 2024. Ethan, now 18 and heading to art school himself, stands beside me as we watch visitors interact with my work. "Mom, do you ever miss the old life?" I consider the question seriously. Do I miss the security of a defined role, the simplicity of letting someone else make the important decisions, the comfort of being small enough to fit into spaces designed for me by others? I miss feeling safe, I tell him honestly. But I'd rather live with the beautiful terror of not knowing what I'm capable of than die slowly in the comfortable certainty of being less than I am. A young reporter from Art in America approaches us, notebook ready. "Ms. Hansen, what advice would you give to women who feel trapped in lives that don't reflect their true selves?" I look around my gallery, at the walls covered with paintings born from pain and transformed into power, at the faces of people moved by art that exists only because I refuse to stay invisible. "Start painting your own portrait," I tell her. "Not the one others expect to see, but the one that lives in your secret heart. Paint it boldly, paint it honestly, and paint it big enough that no one can ignore it. Because the world needs to see who you really are, even if, especially if, it scares the people who prefer you small. And if they tell you your art is worthless." I smile, thinking of Richard in his studio apartment, probably watching coverage of my retrospective on his phone, finally understanding what he'd lost. Then you price it high enough to prove them wrong, and you never, ever apologize for taking up space. The reporter scribbles notes, but I'm no longer paying attention to her questions. Instead, I'm watching a middle-aged woman standing in front of numbers don't understand the heart, Richard's portrait, on loan from the Museum of Contemporary Art for this retrospective. She's crying, but not from sadness. From recognition. From the relief of seeing her own experience reflected in art, of knowing she's not alone in her struggle to be seen, to be valued, to be remembered as more than just supporting cast in someone else's story. That's when I know, beyond any doubt, that my revenge was perfect. Not because I destroyed the man who tried to diminish me, but because I transformed his attempts to make me invisible into art that helps other women become impossible to ignore. I didn't just survive him. I painted my revenge, and it sold for a fortune. But more importantly, it bought me something priceless. The rest of my life, lived on my own terms, at the exact volume I choose. And that, my friends, is a masterpiece no one can ever take away. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt trapped in a life that doesn't reflect your true self, remember this. It's never too late to pick up the brush and start painting your own portrait. The world is waiting to see who you really are.